in case, although the last videos were immediately posted on Twitch, recording, and this is a talk that I have given over the years in Spanish. It's the first time that I'm giving it in English, so I did a quick translation, and thanks to the mods of our Discord community for revising the texts for me. And closing all the windows so that I don't have any interruptions. Okay, so now we are ready. Let me share the other screen. And this is it. Once upon a time, a video game narrative workshop. So, okay. I don't know how many of you are interested in writing stories, or you're just curious about my writing process. I've always thought, I was always interested in writing. I began reading books at a young age, and I was always interested about, I was curious to learn if there's any theory about writing, or it's just, putting words on a piece of paper and that's it. It turns out that there is quite a bit of theory, a very interesting theory. So in this talk, yeah, don't worry, I don't care about the chat. It's just I love seeing the conversations happening, and I'm always making reference to the chat. So feel free to just talk. I don't mind it. So the first time I realized that there's a lot of theory behind writing was when I attended a seminary by Robert McKee, who is a scriptwriter from Hollywood. I don't necessarily agree with everything Robert said in this seminar, but there are many concepts that I found to be fascinating, and that's, they've helped me a great deal in my writing. So how I'm going to organize this talk? First, it's not going to be 4 hours long like last Tuesday. Don't worry, it's probably 90 minutes at most. If there's anything that comes to mind and you want to ask questions, go ahead, no problem. And I'm going to first share a bit of the theory that I learned over the years. Some of it is my own appreciation about how to approach storytelling in video games. It's a bit different when you write for video games. I'm going to describe the process behind games like Scratches, Serena, how this theory that I'm going to give you, I used it for our games at Senscape, and finally some useful tools you can use to outline a story or organize a longer project, and inspiration. Perhaps you have tons of ideas already, and you don't need to get you inspired, but sometimes it's the other way around. Like you have all the tools, you have the talent, but you need that spark that triggers a story in your mind. So I'm going to get to that as well. So let's begin with this. What is a whoa? That's too bright. Okay, it almost left me blind. What is a story? There are many definitions, about how do we understand a story. So the easiest one, the simplest one, is that it's a series of situations and events that form a plot. That's it. Go on, go write your story. That's all you need to know. Of course not. There's much more to this, but this is just the basics. It's just let's start understanding the structure of a story. Situation. We go to know situation. We go. Stuff happens. It's all interconnected. This one. Oops. Damn you, Keynote. This one is a bit more. It's a bit more interesting. I've seen it I've seen it around. So it's a dramatization of daily or fictional facts. How do we understand this? So imagine you are walking in the street. You see a car crash, and then you run to your friend to tell and tell him or her that about what you just saw. And you go on and say, wow, you've no idea. I saw this incredible car crash. There was a huge explosion, limbs flying everywhere. In truth, it was just a small scratch, but you are embellishing the story. You are adding some color and extra sounds and information to get feedback. So you are trying to get a reaction from your friend by making the story more interesting. So we do this a lot. We are all storytellers by default. So when we tell something or just describe an experience, tell something to other people, we are communicating our perception of those events, right? If you think about it, that's quite an issue we have these days with all the misinformation, making the rounds. We embellish things a bit too much, perhaps. But when it comes to storytelling, this is a concept that I want to, I want to insist on this because for me, personally, stories are a form of communication. It's a language. Okay, so we use stories to communicate something, and in some way we are expecting a reaction from our readers, our viewers, our players. We want to spark something in the person that is consuming our story. So one of my favorite writers called Christopher Priest, he said something that has, stuck with me over the years. He said something along the lines that a book does not exist until it's not interpreted. Which means that as writers, the words we lay on the typewriter or your favorite word processor or just a piece of paper, those words have no meaning until they are digested by the reader. So the reader will give another dimension to those words, using the imagination, using, interpreting those words. So this is what I like to, the analogy that I like to do with video games, because when we design a game, we don't know exactly how the player is going to play our game. Especially if it's a non-linear game, you have no idea what you're going to do, in which order they're going to do things. And it's, if you think about it, it's similar to what happens when we read a book. The meaning the author thought about some words may not be the meaning the readers are giving to those words. So this is what I liked of Christopher Priest's notion about writing, and in fact, he writes lots of stories about the experience of being a writer and the question of identity. I will recommend The Affirmation. It's a fantastic novel that makes use of this concept. It's a really very good novel to, if you're interested in writing. Specifically, it has some amazing notions. So there is a constant interaction in a game. There is an ongoing conversation between the designer and the players. And I would say that the way people play our games can reshape them in some way. This is a concept that I have tried to use in all our projects. The way you play our games could give them another meaning. So let's go deeper into these concepts. Okay, every story starts with the germ. Yes, I know this is the term germ is not particularly nice this year, but it's the way we describe it. So first of all, these are the disclaimers. I'm going to give you some theories, some tips. There is no magic recipe for this, okay? There's a bit of interesting theory, but what I tell you here may not be the best way to write the story you have in mind, okay? It should be pretty useful, but don't take all that I say here now, don't take it as gospel, okay? It's my appreciations about the process of writing. Other writers may not agree with it. I will try to give you a way to, some tools to outline your story. This is a fascinating concept that we pretty often, just take it for granted, and we never stop to think about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure if you wrote a story or designed the game already, you've already made use of this concept, but understanding it and identifying this concept, it turns out that is a very nice exercise. So the inciting incident, it's when the story really begins, right? We refer to the inciting incident as the main event that kicks off the main story arc. Okay, so you can have plots, you can have a main plot, you can have subplots, lots of stuff happening in your story, but I guarantee that in every story it all boils down to one thing that happens that puts things in motion. So for example, in the movie 2001, I would say that the inciting incident happens when our ancestors find the monolith for the first time. That inciting incident, it happens very quickly in the story. That incident is what kicks off the main story arc. And sometimes this incident can happen like very fast into the story or very late into the story. Let's talk about Scratches. So I don't know how many of you played Scratches. There's many viewers now, but Scratches was divided into 3 days, right? You're a writer, you arrive to your house to finish a story, and the first moments in the game, in fact, I would say that the entire first day, the story is pretty flat. Like there's not much happening. There's a lot of, things I want you to see. I give you some hints. I want to, to show you things, but nothing really happens. The inciting incident in Scratches happens when Michael the protagonist, sleeps the first night and listens to the scratches for the first time. So that particular event puts in motion many other things, right? And in fact, it's one of the reasons why people found that the first day in the game was a bit boring, because there's not much happening. There's a lot of story, but there's not much happening in the way of the story unfolding, right? See how we are beginning to identify the structure of the story in Scratches. I'll get back to this in a while. Let's another example, Evil Dead, the horror movie. So the time when the inciting incident in Evil Dead happens when they read aloud the Book of the Dead. That's what puts things in motions and wakes up the demons, and all the gory, nasty things begin to happen. Now, let me ask you. This is a nice exercise. Again, let's pick a popular movie like Star Wars. Okay, and this is a complicated one, but there's a lot happening in Star Wars. But the first Star Wars, if I ask you, what do you think it's the inciting incident in Star Wars? Think about, go on, just say it. I'm looking at the chat, go on. Think about what's the main story arc, right? So what's the main purpose of the first trilogy? Leia's message, yes, okay, you are getting close, but I don't agree. I don't agree with it. Many people say that, many people say that the inciting incident in Star Wars happens when Luke hears Leia's message. Yes, but that's not it. Because if you think about it, Star Wars is about Luke's journey, to some extent Darth Vader's redemption, but it's primarily about Luke's journey. And even though when he listens to the message, he's compelled to go on the quest. He's compelled to heed the message, but that's not quite enough. That's not the event that puts things in motion. After he listens to the message and he goes back to the farm and finds that the stormtroopers have murdered his family, that's the inciting incident. That is really the single primary event that puts things in motion in Star Wars. If the stormtroopers didn't murder Luke's family, there will be no Star Wars, okay? At all. Just think about that. Think about how interesting it is to pinpoint the exact moment when the story begins. I find it fascinating. You may not agree with me. It's fine. You may have other ideas. But I would say that's the primary incident in Star Wars, when the stormtroopers kill Luke's family. Anyway, whenever possible, we should try to understand where we are going. This doesn't always happen like this. So you may have a great germ of a story, a great, great beginning, but you don't have an ending. That is going to complicate things. If you know at least where you are going, if you at least know what's the main purpose of your story, or what's going to happen at the end, just try to figure out at least what's the end of the line, because that is when things happen much easier. But I understand this isn't always the case. So come on, keynote. What? Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. So the outcome, right? We are going to discuss. We are going to. I'm going to make use of the three main phases of a story. You probably learned about this in school, we often talk about introduction, knot, and outcome, or the first act, the second act, and the third act. It's okay to keep this in mind when you work in stories. Pretty much the vast majority of stories have this structure. But the outcome, which is the final act. So it's the crucial moment, right, in which reader, player, or spectator experiences the resolution of the story. And this actually has a name. It's called, many writers call it rush of insight. Okay, now your story may not be built upon a twist ending. Maybe it's a dramatic story. Okay, sometimes people may confuse rush of insight to and something unexpected happens and it change everything. Well, it's not. It doesn't have to be that way always. But I'm going to give you an example of a dramatic movie in which it has a moment of rush of insight in which you learn something new that changes the whole meaning of the stories. So again, the rush of insight doesn't necessarily have to change the meaning of the story, but it gives you insight or further or final insight on the motivations of the protagonist. So in Citizen Kane, if you remember, it has a very memorable ending because you try to understand the character. You try to understand why Citizen Kane does what he does throughout the whole movie. And at the ending, there is a revelation. There's just one image that invites you to rethink the whole movie. Oh, so that's why Citizen Kane was who he was. That's why he was doing all of that throughout the movie. You don't have to feel sympathy to the character. You should feel empathy to the protagonist of the story. And the rush of insight sometimes gives you that. In the case of a typical horror story, like in Scratches, the rush of insight is the realization of what was the reason behind the scratches. Okay, this is another interesting concept that it's good to have in mind. So this sometimes stories have a fourth act or coda. Some writers like to use it, writers or designers, right? Some designers like to use it. Some don't see a need for a coda. I don't like it myself. I like the way I write my stories. I like to make my way towards that final rush of insight, that decisive final rush of insight, and end the story. In fact, you don't see many horror stories with the coda. Now, there's a game, I didn't play it. Sorry, I know it's a classic, fantastic game, Shenmue. So many people that love Shenmue, they told me that after the game ends, there's like a long fourth act in which nothing else happens, but you just experience what happens afterwards, what happens after the rush of insight or the outcome of the main narrative arc. And people love that. People really like that, to feel what happens next. Okay, that's what the fourth act is meant to represent, and not all stories need it. When it comes to games, my one of my first suggestions I'm going to give you is to avoid writing linear stories. Of course, stories are linear. When you write them, you go from the beginning to the end. But when you're talking about games, stories begin to become non-linear, and this, going back to the first concepts that we discussed, we don't know how players are going to play our story, And that's why it's good to give them some degree of freedom, just to do things in different orders. Well, I have some graphics to illustrate this. And the concept that I'm going to discuss now, okay, so let's imagine, let's try to imagine how to design a story. So ideally we have a germ and we go towards, we must find our way towards the ending. So we know we are going to follow this path, okay? Ideally, this is what you're going to have, in your final design. It all becomes twisty, and you start with the germ, and you have an option, okay? You start following a path. Sometimes it's going to be you're going to have optional paths. There's a dead ending right in the middle of this scheme. Just don't do that. Try to avoid dead endings. I need to add a line just to get the message through. So don't do that. And these connections between, imagine these are the situations or events in the story. So these lines that go from one event to another, so we call that inflection points, okay, or turning points. You probably heard about this as turning points. So in the story, in a developed story, you're going to have many turning points. Yes. When we design a game, we think about these turning points as milestones that move forward the story. And sometimes, as we're going to see, the player may have an active involvement in those turning points, and sometimes they could be just or they are maybe transparent to the player, or the player has a passive involvement in those turning points. But imagine again that our ultimate goal is to go from the germ to the ending, and just develop, generate events in between. Okay, so make the story interesting. We're going to try, and these events, of course, should have some meaning, right? And but let's think about them as inflection points. Now, here is something that I struggled a lot with this in the case of Scratches, and I call it the illusion of control. Because depending on how complex or multi-layered your story is, or how you want the player to experience the story, so you may have a very strong idea of the vision of the game, and you want people to experience things in a certain order, so that some events, some of these inflection points, are more powerful than others. And it turns out there is a tension in this type of stories. And that tension, if you play Scratches, again, you probably felt that tension in the first day, because I needed you to experience these very specific milestones so that you could understand what happened next. And it seemed as if I was holding your hand throughout these special moments. For example, when you have to look for candles. Why do you need to look for candles? Because I put the candles in special rooms, and when you enter those rooms, you will see the things I want you to see. So, for example, some of the candles are in the kitchen, and when you enter the kitchen, you can feel the basement right to your right, and you can feel the presence of that rotten door, mysterious door, and I wanted you to see that. So, if I didn't force you to look for candles, maybe you could have completed the entire first day without entering the kitchen. And well, actually, no, okay, no, there was another puzzle. It's not the best example. There was another puzzle in the maid's room, so you had to go through the kitchen. But again, that's basically my intention behind that. Was my intention behind all that. In the second day of Scratches, that tension goes away because there's no more hand holding. The second day of Scratches worked so much better because after the first night, after the first dream sequence, I show you that there's something in the gallery, something hidden in the gallery. And naturally, players will try to simply, find out what that is. There's no more hand holding. It turns out that all the puzzles that are laid out in the second day, they're just part of that mystery. And that, why that worked really well, ultimately, why that worked really well, because there was an inciting incident, the Scratches, I put things in motion at that point. So why the first day in Scratches is so boring? Because I spent too much time doing exposition and maybe that wasn't really the best way to do it. Anyway, this tension, it's very difficult to resolve it, I try to give players the illusion of control as in the second day of Scratches. So I show you the carrot, which is the hidden mystery in the gallery, and lay out the path in front of you. So you think that you are in control because you are making your way towards towards finding that mystery, you are solving the puzzles, but in reality, the second day of Scratches was the best one, was the best planned day, because it turns out that you had two mysteries, you had a hidden room, you had something else you needed to find in the gallery, and if you replay the game or if you want to play the game, you'll see that it feels better. But I was still in control. Okay, so I think that's the best part of the game, because it's how the illusion of control. Anyway, yeah, it's a bit difficult to really explain it, but I'm really happy with the way that part in the game worked. Anyway, so the structure. Let's review the structure of a story and what's supposed to happen. What's meant to happen in each phase of the story. The preparation, which is as I said, introduction or the first act. What do you do here? You introduce characters, relationships between them. You try to present their ideology, morality. You introduce places as well, and backstory. And there's a lot of exposition here. What do we mean by exposition? So it's the things we want to communicate the players, but we don't want to do it in an obvious way. So you're not going to have your antagonist, the first time he or she shows up, say, "Hey, hello, I'm the bad guy." Of course, that's not the idea. You through dialogue or situations or actions, description, you just try to communicate key information to the players. Again, Scratches again was an example, maybe not without too much hand holding, just try to avoid that. It's best to try and relate the actions of the player to stuff happening in which you reveal a detail of the story. So that's what we mean by exposition in games. We try to communicate information through actions of the players. So, not what we understand as knot or second acts. So the best way to view it is as this is the main conflict. Okay, every story, unless it's a very experimental story or slice of life, it's called, when nothing happens, there's no conflict. Some writers get away with that. Just don't try to do that, because you need to be extremely talented. Because if you don't have conflicts, the story can get very, very boring. So let's say conflict, something that troubles the protagonist in some way, and the idea, the final goal, is to resolve that conflict. Yes, so we consider the story concluded. We consider that the story has concluded when the conflict is resolved. So the story unfolds with all the inflection points through this conflict. And typically, you're going to try and have subtext here, so subtext is when you want to you say something, but in reality means something else. So if you need to, try to figure out how to organize or structure your key events in the story, so try to leave most of the exposition to the preparation or introduction, because it doesn't feel right to have exposition during the conflict, because it feels like maybe it's not the right time to introduce new information. Okay, again, this isn't the rule of thumb, this is just a suggestion. Okay, so if you start introducing too much exposition during the conflict, it feels as if you're pausing the story and your players can get bored. That's one of the tricks I wanted to tell you. So then we already discussed it. The resolution is the outcome. So the climax of the story when the conflict is resolved. So typically, the first inflection point kicks off the conflict. Okay, and the last one brings us the rush of insight. Okay, this is again to try and understand how we structure the story, and we need to identify those moments. The first inflection point, which becomes the inciting incident, okay, and the last inflection point, which is the rush of insight. We are going to have other inflection points or turning points, but these two are the main one. Try to avoid doing exposition after the first inflection point. And no matter how how experimental your story is, there is always an outcome. So at some point your story is going to end, because, well, at least when it comes to narrative games, they aren't infinite. At some point you want to finish the game, you want to wrap up the story. So I always put a lot of emphasis on the ending. For me, the ending can make or break a good story. So you can have good stories that with a weak ending, they sort of become forgettable. And I can guarantee you that you can have a so-so story with a mind-blowing ending, and that mind-blowing ending makes you say, wow, that wasn't so bad, So I put a lot of importance on the ending. Okay, we're almost halfway through. How are we doing? Is everybody still there? I see a lot of viewers, but everybody's quiet. Are you paying attention, or still there, folks? We're going to, I love this because again, it's fascinating. It's fascinating once you realize how this works. This is what Kurt Vonnegut was a fantastic, super talented writer, and he attempted to describe the shapes of stories. And he nailed all these shapes of stories to just 4. And trust me, it really works. So the first one, I mean, let's try to understand these graphics. And here's another rule. Here's another key, very important rule, that it's best if you try to fulfill this requirement. So you have the timeline beginning towards the end, and you have the vertical axis. It goes from good fortune to bad fortune. Okay. In most stories, it turns out that the protagonist goes through a conflict, and we said that his or her fortune goes from good to bad. And sometimes it starts well, okay, it ends worse, or it gets better. And yeah, so let's go through all of this. Okay, the first one is called Man in Whole, or Human or Woman in Whole. Let's make it more inclusive these days. So if you look at it, that curve, the character, the protagonist, ends with a bit more of good fortune. So they are not on the same level, right? How do we understand this? So the protagonist was having a good life, a good moment, suddenly a conflict is introduced, lots of things happen in between, and after the conflict is resolved, the protagonist ends with a bit more of good fortune. This is exactly the shape of Star Wars. Exactly the shape of Star Wars. So Luke had good fortune when the movie began. When the conflict with the Empire, starts, and all the happenings in the story take place, Luke finds himself with ill fortune. When it ends, he becomes a Jedi, so he has better fortune than the beginning of the story. Most video games, I would say most video games, have this shape. Scratches has this shape, exactly this shape. Okay, Michael is good, begins writing the story. All the nasty issue with the scratches and all the revelations in the house, and when the story ends, Michael is actually a bit better than he was in the beginning because he got to finish his story. This one, boy meets girl, or the other way around, or this is the shape of romantic comedies. They are all like this. So the protagonist, let's say the boy, begins with a neutral fortune. Suddenly he falls in love. He gains a lot of good fortune because he found the love of his life. Okay, he loses that love, so the worst ill possible fortune, and at the end he gets the girl back. Now let's just don't necessarily think about love or relationships, because this applies to any sort of story in which the protagonist gains something, loses that throughout the conflict, and at the end gains it back. The Cinderella, it's called Cinderella because it's sort of like the boy meets girl shape, but it's more exaggerated. So Cinderella begins with very bad fortune. She meets the prince, she falls in love, she experiences bliss and happiness. Then he loses the prince, or she loses her shoe, or what happens in the story. She falls from grace back to ill fortune, and at the end she gets back the princess, and they all lived happily ever after towards infinite. So that's the shape of most fables. And yes, Kafka, you begin with ill fortune, and then it all goes straight to hell, and it keeps getting worse towards infinite. this is the shape of Serena, which we're going to discuss in just a few moments. Okay, so it always goes, it keeps getting worse, and it's very depressing. It's that's what it's called, Kafkaesque. So this is another nice exercise. So try to, when you watch a movie or when you play a game, try to understand what's the shape of the story. And yes, I really, I do agree with this. The protagonist should experience some shift in the fortune so that the story feels relevant. Because if the protagonist doesn't experience some change, some sort of change in mood or in fortune, it feels as if nothing really happened, and the story, there was no point to the story. That's again what's called slice of life. I woke up today, I went to work, then I got back to home, fell asleep, and I was the same person I was in the morning. That's the crappiest story ever. So, in truth, you want something to happen to your protagonist so that it feels that something changed throughout the story. Okay? This is just a few pointers. People sometimes ask me, what do I do if I have a game? How do I add a story to the game? Or if I have a story, how do I turn the story into a game? Let's make this one quick, because there's a lot more theory here. But think about that a game has game mechanics, okay? And sometimes those mechanics are strongly tied to the story, and some of the times it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So, for example, you start working on a prototype, you just begin programming, and you have an interesting concept. Okay, so what do I do with the story? I want to have to put some meaning, a setting into this game, so bring the story to this game. However, if you begin working on the mechanics first, and you have a game that is not narrative from the go, I'm going to give you these tips, but imagine that the story will feel disconnected somehow from the game, because it's always best, if you want to tell a story, a really strong story, and you want to make the players feel really involved in the story, you will have to work, from the beginning with the story and the mechanics of the game, so that they grow together organically. When we develop adventure games, this is exactly what we try to do with the puzzles. So we have a story, we think about the puzzles, we say, okay, so this puzzle is maybe related to this inflection point, and this inflection point generates this particular event in the story, but we always try to make it feel as if the puzzles are entangled with the story somehow. So, if you came up with the mechanics first and you need a story, okay, so what motivates the protagonist? Let's say you created a platformer such as Mario, and okay, what motivates Mario to find the princess? For all intents and purposes, at least in the case of Super Mario, he could be finding, making his way towards a sandwich. It doesn't change the game at all. I mean, the mechanics are the same. That's what I mean, that the story doesn't feel very connected to the game. Okay, so you still want to have a story. What motivates the protagonist? Okay, try to find a goal for the protagonist. Find the reasons behind mechanics and the role in the story. So, back to the example of Mario. So maybe you thought about, the mushroom. You just thought about, hey, maybe he eats a mushroom and he grows. Okay, so why would he need to eat the mushroom, or what does the mushroom have to do? So you bring characters that are mushrooms, and suddenly the mushroom, gains another meaning. You just try to find the reason behind a particular mechanic so that it somehow fits the story you want to bring to the game. Generate situations that enrich the story. Maybe a level that has a particular meaning, a boss that has a particular meaning. If you're just bringing this to the game, try to make it interesting somehow. Think about again, things that give purpose to the meanings and interesting situations. And again, probably the character, the protagonist, will have a passive involvement in the story. It's like the story just is floating around the game. This is because the mechanics came first. If the story came first, well, this is pretty much what we are trying to do throughout this talk. So, what do? Identify elements or milestones that advance the story, inflection points. When I get to Serena, I will give you a very specific example of how to achieve this, or possible ways to achieve this. Link the inflection points to players' actions. Again, we want to make it feel as if the actions from the player are meaningful. Okay, so they have a meaning and they advance the story. Draft a semi-novel. So it turns out that I didn't know that this was a typical practice in the writing industry. It just feels very natural. So script writers, before they begin working or just writing a script, they lay out the script in prose format. They just write the story in a very, it's drafty. It's you don't need to do any proofreading. It's a treatment, but it's the story as if it was a very short novel. This is what I did with Scratches, with Serena then, and now with Asylum. And it's helpful in games, even if the game is meant to be non-linear, even if the story won't have a lot of relevance in the game. It's a good idea to just write it down. Just a few pages. Just lay it out. If there are puzzles in the game, just describe them in this semi-novel. It helps. It really helps as a source of as a reference point as well. And the player can have an active involvement in the story because of all of this. We have the story, and we are from the story trying to build the game mechanics. This is really the way adventure games are mostly designed. Okay, so we always start with the story in mind, and then we work towards the puzzles. And so things, again, just a few pointers here. It's always useful to get a sense of space. So at least in the games we do, I always find it very useful to just think about the environment as well, and maybe how the environment has some relation to the story or puzzles. Okay, trying to understand where the story will take place and unfold, it can give you a good idea of how to design a better game. So backstory is backstory. Leave it there. Please don't do what George Lucas did with Star Wars. There's a reason why in Star Wars, it was fascinating because it felt like there was so much story, so much things happening, such a rich universe. And really, the whole point of the prequels is to experience all that backstory. We already knew what happened. We don't really feel... I don't know if there's people that love the prequels here. I'm sorry, I just found them to be unnecessary. I just don't feel like we learned much new. We just... all that backstory, it was brought to the front. So if you have backstory in your game, make it subtle. Even if you are really proud of that backstory, just don't, leave it there if you can. Just it makes the game more more interesting and fascinating, more, you know, big and encompassing if you have a rich backstory, which is only perceived by players, not necessarily experienced, but perceived. This one is very important, and again, something I learned over the years: don't underestimate players, appeal to their imagination and powers of observation. So sometimes you are worried that players won't understand something and you want to drive the message through, so you insist on that point, and you make it very obvious. I guarantee you it's not necessary. Just even if you feel like players really need to learn something crucial, maybe it's best to be subtle about it, because it even makes replays more interesting. Okay, because players will feel like, even if they didn't discover it in the first in the first playthrough, the next time they play the game, they'll say, "Oh wow, I didn't quite realize that at first. Wow!" So it's another good technique that I recommend doing it. So this is again something, it's more related to the movie industry. So it's preferable to show, don't tell. And in video games, it also happens. Okay, so try to tell things, to show things through the game, and avoid too much text. Sometimes, I mean, it's perfect to have text. I love having text in our games. I love to read, even if it's a piece of document or a piece of just a note. You can just hint at things with the note instead of just telling them outright. This is what I mean by that. Except that in the case, I think, okay, there you. Come on, Keynote. Are you there, Keynote? So the other tip is that in the case of the horror genre, it sometimes works better to just maybe describe something instead of showing it. A good analogy here about this would be Lovecraft's tales, in which he rather described things or used atmosphere to communicate something, rather than showing you the horror or the monster. Okay, this is what I mean, that use the atmosphere, tell it through the atmosphere instead of showing it outright. Always favor interaction in games. And whenever possible, players' action should trigger some degree of exposition or subtext. I mean, what I mean by this is, again, try to make it seem as if the actions of the player are moving the story forward somehow. So, solving a puzzle. So when you solve a puzzle, something should happen in the story that was meaningful somehow. Again, tips in general. So, inspiration. How to inspire yourself if Keynote decides to react. I don't know. Thank you, Keynote. Suggestions. Where do we seek inspiration? You still there? Few people have left, so I hope, it seems like you're paying attention, hopefully. This one is important. Note down anything that comes to mind. We note down anything that comes to mind in our commonplace book. Lots of writers make use of this. Lovecraft had a commonplace book. You can actually look it up online, and it's filled with exciting ideas. And I do mean absolutely everything that comes to mind. So, as I'm going to show you, there was a germ that gave birth to the story in Serena, and it was just a small blurb of an idea that was in the in my notebook, commonplace. Name it the way you want it. Just note down everything. Another very good example, I think. I recently wrote a short story, a short horror story that I based on something that I experienced decades ago. So when I went to school, each time I went back from school, there was this old man in a house. He was always in the front of the house, and that old man terrified me to death because he had these big bulging eyes, sort of, pointy nose, and he would look at me like this when I walk through his house when I came back from school. And I swear to you, I had nightmares about that poor old man. I noted that down in just a piece of note that from paper it became a note in Evernote or a Word document or whatever. And only 2 years ago, I actually wrote a story based on that germ. Okay, it was just an idea, just an old man at the front of his house. That was the idea. Just that. That's what I mean. That anything that catches your attention somehow, for whatever reason, there's a reason why it caught your attention. Just note it down, because I did write a horror story about that old man, and this. I mean, I'm an adult now, and I understood. I gave a different meaning. Instead of writing a story in which the old man was a sadist that maybe kidnaps a kid and does horrible things to that kid, I wrote a more poignant story in which the perspective of the kid changed over the years about that old man. But anyway, just write it down. Write everything down. Seek inspiration in the world that surrounds us. I mean, we are living in possibly the weirdest year in a long time. So, just go outside and the entire world is stranger than fiction. So if you need inspiration, just look outside. Read. Most of my ideas, I would say, came from reading a lot, watching movies as well, but reading a lot as well. Take long walks. Sometimes you need to clear your mind. Maybe just go outside, walk, think. Maybe with your mind in blank, and when you come back home, suddenly something pops up. Again, an example: Lovecraft used to take very long walks through his hometown in Providence, and that's how the case of Charles Dexter Ward, one of his best stories, was born. Just with a long walk. Read even more. And these two are important. They are so important that Evernote, Keynote, I don't know why, it sort of is crashing on me. Bloody Keynote. Understand what inspires us. In the next section, I'm going to discuss that. But understand why you like something so much. Distill its essence. In the case of Lovecraft, I loved his stories, and over the years, I understood that what I loved was the atmosphere in his stories. When he described something that felt almost out of time, or I felt like I was there because the description was so rich and detailed. So that's what I loved about Lovecraft stories, the atmosphere. Okay, so he inspires me, yes, but why? The atmosphere. See what inspired those who inspire us. Since we have the Lovecraft example, Lovecraft was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, by Lord Dunsany, for among others. Understanding, if you need to make that connection, understanding what has inspired those who inspire you will give you a better understanding of what finally is inspiring you. In the case of Edgar Allan Poe was the macabre, maybe. In the case of Lord Dunsany, it was the fantastic, unknown, faraway lands, which is fear of the unknown, if one of the main components in Lovecraft stories. So we, through Lord Dunsany, we maybe understand a bit better Lovecraft. That's what I have in mind with this suggestion. So let's talk games now. This part of understanding what inspires us. I fell in love with King's Quest from the first moment that I played many years ago. So this particular scene exemplifies what the game communicated to me back then. What it was so fascinating to just walk around Daventry, and I always found fascinating to just think about what's coming next, what's beyond the horizon. And King's Quest allowed me to go beyond the horizon. I just walk towards that faraway mountain and I go to another screen. And because the game is designed in a sort of sandbox mode, you can just you walk towards the edge of the map and come through the other edge of the map. It felt as it like it was endless, like you could explore it endlessly. I think because I played King's Quest at a very young age, and exploration plays such a big part in the game, and I'm sure that's why in the games we do at Senscape, exploration plays a very important role. So I want to give you the liberty, the freedom to let you move throughout our setting as you want and explore it. Just explore it. And even though Asylum and King's Quest are completely different games, they share this in common. The exploration, the approach is similar, as in the freedom we give you to explore the setting. This is Moby, and it's a very difficult game. It's an obscure game, and this particular aspect of Moby Island, which is finding hidden things in the scene. I'm pretty sure this inspired me to make the environments as detailed as possible. Just invite you, encourage you to go really to get into the scene and look at for hidden details. I was so happy whenever I found a hidden object with a magnifying glass in Maupiti Island. In fact, there was almost a feature that didn't make it to Scratches. By the end of the game, when you finished Maupiti Island, you had a message telling you simply, okay, so you discovered this amount of hints or this many hints, like 80% of hints. That's what I wanted to include in Scratches, just to let you know if you found if you should have noticed all the hints because they were in front of you. At least that sort of score to let you know, hey, you did stumble into this. You should have realized about this hint. That's how much Mopiti Island inspired me. So this one called Dark Seed, I'll admit it. It has lots of dead ends, rather shoddy design, but it's a fantastic game still. I love it. It has a fantastic atmosphere, and what Dark Seed has, and I can, again, you can find this element in Scratches, in Serena, in Asylum. Darkseid gives you a very good notion of passage of time. In fact, the game is divided into 3 days. That's why Scratches is divided into 3 days. You can feel, since you, from the moment you start the game, that, time passes by. And as time passes by, things happen in the game. So not nighttime approaches. As nighttime approaches, you can feel the tension that the day is coming to an end and something is going to happen next, and that's the main structure of Scratches. So I need to thank Darkseid a lot for that. Another game that inspired me a lot, I don't know if Jonathan or Matt are online. I told them to be online. This is Darkfall. So this is a game that Jonathan did in 2001, and it not only prompted me or encouraged me to do my own first game. I mean, one guy in the UK was able to make this fantastic game on his own. That's what prompted me to say, hey, I'm just one guy, or two guys in Argentina can make a game, right? And that's what we did with Scratches. But the two things that really stood out for me in Darkfall was the sense of space. I can explore this abandoned hotel, and the way the scenes are designed. You always feel like you are traversing this game, at your pace, and you have complete freedom to explore this side. So I think in this regard, I'm not a huge fan of Myst, but even I will say it even objectively, when it comes to designing a virtual environment you can explore, Darkfall is much better than Myst. I mean, it fulfilled that, it accomplished that task so much better than Myst. The navigation in Darkfall, I think it's very solid, just to give you that sense of space, of the dimensions of the place. So these four guys have also inspired me a lot over the years. In fact, I brought up this picture. They are all gone now, sadly. The movie House by the Long Shadows played a key role in Scratches. So if you play the game and then you watch the movie, in fact, the beginning is actually very similar. I must confess, the first moments are actually similar. But you can see how the elements of this movie somehow found a place in Scratches. Lucio Fulci and is a movie that fascinated me as a kid. My obsession with basements come from this movie. I think that's why you will see reference to Lucio Fulci in everything I do. So this movie is to be blamed for the basement in Scratches and the basement that you're going to find in Asylum. And this is an author that has inspired me a lot. Let's wrap up. I'm almost very close to wrapping up the talk with this case study of Serena. Let me show you the germ if Keynote decides to react. Come on, how can you consume so many resources? Okay, so thank you. This is the germ of the story. It's not exactly, if you play Serena, and if not, it's probably a good idea to play it after this talk. If you are interested in writing a story, you will realize how sometimes the germ you have in mind takes different shape in the game itself. So, man is alone in a room, constantly waiting for the return of his wife. That's how the game begins. Fine. Little by little, his face begins to change whenever he looks at the mirror, each time becoming more cadaverous, or sort of a pallid and bony face. If you play the game, this isn't exactly true. What changes and becomes cadaverous is Serena's picture. right? Keep this in mind. This is very interesting to understand the process that went behind the design of the game. The wife never arrives. Eventually, he discovers some bones. Yes, this is pretty much how the game unfolds. And originally, this is the weirdest coincidence, I guarantee you, the weirdest one. The story was meant to be called Helena, because that was the name of the wife. If you remember, we created the game Serena to honor a wonderful member of the adventure game community called Serena, and by a strange coincidence of life, Serena sounds very similar to Helena. So this is the story I had in mind. A man is waiting for his wife. Mind-blowing, unexpected ending. So I must find my way towards the mind-blowing, unexpected ending. So I try to come up with the main events, okay? The inflection points. What are the main events that we're going to need to go from here to here? That's how that part of the idea of the protagonist changing his face, that's how that element became something else. So I thought, okay, we should probably have some sort of puzzle with this. So how about, instead of looking at his face change, how about that's meant to be Serena's face? So how about that is a puzzle in which you have to remember her face? So he's waiting for his wife, and the first task is, who was my wife? That's, the game begins hasty and surreal, and we don't really know what's happening, but that's the first task, remembering her face. Then who? Serena, her face. Why did she left? Did something happen? There we go, the second puzzle, remembering the fight. Then a revelation. Something must happen when we discover the bones before the big revelation at the end. So that's the third puzzle. See how just by trying to impose some restrictions or requirements in the story, some puzzles begin to take shape. Remembering her face, remembering her fight, remembering the fight, opening the closet. Those are the three main events in the game. The three main inflection points in the game. And if you look at this is the final design. This is actually the design of the game. It's part of the design document that you can find on Discord if you go. What did I do with this? So I have the three main phases of the game. It's a short game, so yes, it was quite linear. It was short, it was meant to be played in less than 1 hour maybe. But note how I try to develop things between these phases of the game, right? So what do I need to do to remember her face? I need to look at the comb, and I need to read a poem that will give me, will remind me of something. So I can do those things in a non-linear way. I can look at the comb and read the poem, in any order I want. But when I do that and the photograph is revealed, we are done with the main phase or inflection point of the game. And I think Serena is a fantastic example to understand this approach to design, because it's a short game. And in a much longer adventure game, this diagram you see here is going to be way more complicated. So many more things are going to happen, and you may have different phases that can be played in any order you want. In fact, Asylum is like that. We have many phases, main events, if you want, and you can play them in any way you want. That's why the design is so much more complicated and the implementation is a nightmare. But the more non-linear the game gets, the more difficult it is to do, but the more rewarding it is for players. Okay, and this same approach is what I did in the other main events of the game, which is remembering the fight. You can do two things in any order, and uncovering the corpse. In fact, uncovering the corpse, since we are getting near the end of the game, it does get more linear, and it always happens, and it's fine. If you have a main ending in mind, a main strong ending, you don't have alternate endings in your design, the game will get more linear towards the end. That was the brief overview of Serena. These are the links, so you can download the game through that address, or just look it up on Steam if you didn't play it. If you want to check out the game design document, we posted it on Discord for the Adventure House Game Jam. It's in the channel Resources and Tips, and it's interesting, something that it was unexpected. We didn't expect this at all with Serena, but it was very rewarding for us, the designers, all the developers that collaborated with the game. If I don't know if some of you are in this stream now, but we had a great time doing the game, and it was very rewarding to see that people spend more time discussing the story rather than playing it. And for me, that's a particular accomplishment. I always, that's my ultimate goal. I want to get you, to hear your theories and just prompt discussion. That's why I like to have endings that are, that provide a lot of rush of insight, so that you spend a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, what has just happened? Let me analyze this rush of insight, try to try to recreate the entire story in my mind, and try to figure out things. Anyway, so the last part of this talk, just some tools that I recommend using. So these are this is Scrivener, and I have used it a lot over the years. I began drafting Asylum on Scrivener. Then I tried another tool, and I always keep coming back to Scrivener. This is available on Mac or Windows, and I mean, you can draft your semi-novel on Word document, but you're going to need more things, right? You're going to need a better structure to design the game, right? To separate sections, to it's always a good idea to begin, dividing the story into smaller sections. So you write this one today, you write another one tomorrow, and that gives you a sense of progress. Some writers like to just, blank piece of paper and start writing and go on, okay? It's actually good. I recommend this approach, just to understand the structure of your story and keep a nice feature of Scrivener is that you can keep all the things you want, all the reference, all the researches that you do, you keep them in the same document. And as you can see, I use, for example, I have the main game content, which is I have the design document, which is the semi-novel, the main game content, in which they are the documents that appear in the game. So, for example, all the notes you read, the books or tapes you find, they are in that section. And then references, notes, research, but it's all here. It's all here, and I always like to keep things in the same document because I find that there's always, I'm always taking down notes, and I prefer by the time we are almost done with the game, I'm going to review all of this in case there's a reference I wanted to include, or maybe just a feedback I wanted to mention somewhere. So before I wrap up the writing, I'm going to go through all these projects, Scrivener project, just to make sure that everything I wanted, to put in the game. Well, okay, not everything, because there's a lot of stuff that we are rejecting. Don't worry. By this point, we are in. Let's finish the goddamn, game. So let's implement the game logic and the remaining game logic, and that's it. But it's always, so many after so many notes over the years, it's always a good, a good way to refresh yourself of maybe why you did things this way, etc. Another option, if you are using Mac, Ulysses is a good tool if you prefer a more minimalistic approach. If you don't want too many icons and stuff, it's very laid down and minimal, and you might like that. This is a very I would say that Scrivener and Ulysses are the best writing tools in the market by far, and I tried many. Another way you may have to design a game is use mind maps. I don't particularly like this approach very much, but we all do things in different ways. So this is I did this for the talk in Spanish. Basically, it's a mind map of the Serena story. So the idea when you do a mind map, you create your diagram from a main idea, which is Serena, and one suggestion is to try and in each branch of the mind map you put, this is the story outline, these are the characters that are involved in the game, and these characters have these traits, they are related in this way maybe, and you have a place and you have a cabin and you have these objects in the cabin, and then the main design of the game or puzzles. This is just another approach. You just if you never used mind maps, you simply start branching ad infinitum. You branch from this main idea. Twine. We actually have a sort of simple implementation of Serena in Twine as an exercise that I did a while ago, and it turns out that Twine is an excellent prototyping tool. Okay, so Twine, you can write visual novels or just interactive novels with Twine, and it could work as a design tool. It could. I would say that for to try a quick idea maybe, or just to lay out an idea, it's so quick. It's so you can make a game so quickly. I mean, you can outline a game fairly quickly on Twine. Of course, larger games can take a lot of time, especially if you have much text. But it's pretty, fast to put nodes, connect them, and just try to get the sense of the flow of the story. Yarn, we once investigated this tool for Asylum. We didn't use it in the end. We needed something more specific, so we ended doing our own dialogue system. But this is a fantastic tool to create dialogues, and it's built upon Twine. This is why I'm bringing it up. This is originally the work of Infinite Ammo. They used it for Night in the Woods, if I'm not mistaken, and it's free and open source. This is probably a tool you may investigate if you need it. And Trello. We have used Trello to organize our, the development of Asylum over the years. You can also use Trello create the outline of a story. Actually, I can see it how writers could also use it, especially if you need to collaborate. This is a great, very powerful tool, free to use. So if you've never used Trello before, it's based on Kanban, so you have lists with tasks and you can move the tasks from list to list, and that gives the team, a sense of progress, because we have there the done list. So when we are done with something, we move it to the done list. It's a very good tool. And these are the links, and that's it. That's the end of the talk. 90 minutes, as I promised. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I actually did it in 90 minutes. This is fantastic. Okay, so I hope this was useful. Now, if you are participating in the Venturos Game Jam, which has just begun today, you won't have to spend so much time planning and designing, because the idea is to make a quick game. We recommend maybe you spend the weekend outlining the game. If you're not participating in the jam, I hope this was useful, just to give you a sense, of at least my process behind, the design of a story. And good luck. If you are, yes, I am going to upload the moment I end the stream, it gets uploaded to Twitch, but I'm going to upload a higher res version to YouTube, probably later today, because I won't do a lot of editing, don't worry. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. I hope, again, if you participate in the jam, lots of luck. We are very much looking forward to see your games. And stop by Discord to check out the design document of Serena, or just get in touch with us. Thank you so much for joining this talk, and have a fantastic weekend. See you around. Bye bye.